international humanitarian law obligations. It is likely that some of these actions amount to war crimes. These actions merit the strongest possible response available to this Council. In particular, the Council must use all its powers to ensure accountability for any crimes under international law, including war crimes and crimes against humanity committed during the conflict and occupation. The ICJ therefore urges this Council to counter impunity by creating a commission of inquiry as proposed in the draft resolution. The Commission must be accorded all necessary powers and resources to document and analyze crimes under international law and violation of human rights and international humanitarian law related to the conflict. I thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Human Rights Watch.
We left because we have no bomb shelter, Yulia told Human Rights Watch. Mr. President, close to 700,000 have fled Ukraine in search of safety, and over 100,000 have been internally displaced. At the border, we witnessed despair and disbelief. Lines of cars stretch for kilometers. People lack food and water and face freezing temperatures. On the very first day of the invasion, Russian forces used cluster munitions in a strike just outside a hospital in Volodar, killing 4 civilians. Recent attacks in populated areas of multiple cities have clearly illustrated the inherently indiscriminate nature of cluster munitions and wide-impact explosive weapons. Targeted, indiscriminate, and disproportionate attacks on civilians are war crimes. The Council should urgently establish a commission of inquiry to investigate all allegations of violations in Ukraine, to collect and preserve evidence and identify those responsible. We welcome the decision by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to open an investigation. In Russia, over 6,000 anti-war protesters have been detained, and multiple independent media outlets blocked over their factual reporting on the war. This too should be the subject of Council scrutiny. For 8 years, civilians have borne the brunt of the armed conflict in eastern Ukraine, from indiscriminate attacks to travel restrictions, limited access to food, healthcare, education, and basic services. The Council should send a strong message that there will be no impunity for the crimes committed in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra a joint statement, Engineer Dumont.
Welcome this urgent meeting on Russia's aggression against the people of Ukraine. On the 24th of February, the Ukrainian ambassador requested this council to meet, quote, as urgently as possible. Now, in other past situations, the council convened within a day. Why this time on Russian aggression did it wait a full week? For the men, women, and children under attack, every day of delay by the international community is lethal. This council just heard from the Russian foreign minister. He said President Putin has, quote, an unwavering respect for the Ukrainian people, and that, quote, we do not intend in any way to infringe on the interests of the citizens of Ukraine. Mr. President, the opposite is true. The truth is that Russian forces invaded Ukraine in flagrant violation of the United Nations Charter and international law. The truth is that Russian forces are bombing cities indiscriminately, killing and wounding innocent civilians, a gross violation of the Geneva Conventions and international humanitarian law. The truth is that Russia's assault on Ukraine has turned 500,000 people into refugees, forcing them to flee their home for neighboring countries, killed an estimated 2,000 people, and injured many more. The truth is that Russia is committing war crimes. And so the question before us today is this: will the international community defend the rules-based international order? Dictators around the world are watching. If they see that Russia succeeds in its wanton aggression, they will draw the lesson that anything goes. We will see more invasions, more tyrannies, attacking their neighbors, and more terrorism. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra International Bar Association.
The International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute resolutely condemns the ongoing and unjustified military invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation as a flagrant violation of international law, including the UN Charter. We are dismayed at the emerging reports of violations of international human rights and humanitarian law, including violations of the right to life, liberty and security occurring in Ukraine. We also firmly condemn the arbitrary detention of peaceful protesters in the Russian Federation and in Belarus, and violations of the right to assembly, association and expression and media freedom. We are alarmed by ongoing violations in areas controlled by Russia and in the temporarily Russia-occupied Crimea, involving extrajudicial killings, abductions and enforced disappearances. The Bari urges the Russian Federation to immediately and unconditionally cease its military invasion into the Ukrainian territory. We urge all parties to ensure immediate, safe and unhindered humanitarian access. The Bari welcomes the decision of the ICC prosecutors to proceed with opening an investigation into the situation in Ukraine. We call on this Council to take all possible actions to ensure accountability for perpetrators, to end impunity and to prevent further deterioration of the situation. The Bari strongly supports the establishment of a commission of inquiry to initiate prompt, independent and impartial investigation into all violations. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Associazione Comunità Papa Giovanni 23.
APG 23 calls for an immediate halt to hostilities in Ukraine. Once again, the folly of war is being chosen, the most devastating impact of which falls on civilians and defenseless populations. We would like to echo what Pope Francis said: those who wage war forget humanity. They do not start from the people, but put partisan interest and power in front of everything. With our long practice as a non-violent peace corps in war zone, we witnessed the catastrophic consequences of wars, widows, orphans and destroyed lives. On the other side, we experienced the constructive force of non-violence. The war in Ukraine, like any other conflict, violates the human rights of individuals and peoples to peace, as well as all the other human rights. We express our solidarity with the populations involved in this conflict and support the efforts of civil society in Ukraine and the Russian Federation, working towards an immediate cessation of hostilities for embarking on a path of true peace and reconciliation. A process of disarmament is urgently needed to guarantee peace. Even more urgent is the need to prevent an escalation into a nuclear war and ensure the humanitarian protection of civilians by also activating humanitarian corridors. In this regard, APG 23, as other NGOs, has already started its humanitarian mobilization. We appeal to the UN and all concerned parties to strive for an end to the fighting, by all means of diplomacy, implementing the principle of peaceful settlement of disputes. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra United Nations Watch.
Council prepared to defend international peace and basic human rights, to oppose aggression on a scale unseen in Europe since World War II? Will they uphold their responsibility to defend the rules-based international order? Let us consider. 2 years ago, despite our urgent appeals not to do it, the UN elected Russia as a member of this Human Rights Council. This violated the Council's own rules. Members are obliged to uphold the highest standards of human rights. Mr. President, does this Council believe that Russia's bombing of civilians in Kiev, Kharkiv, and other cities and towns across Ukraine upholds the highest standards of human rights? Under the Council's rules, members can be removed on account of gross and systematic violations of human rights. Therefore, if this Council is serious, here's what it must do. 1. Remove Russia from the Council immediately. 2. Adopt a resolution on the situation of human rights within Russia itself. 3. Establish an independent monitor to protect courageous Russian dissidents, such as Alexei Navalny and Vladimir Karamurza, both of whom were poisoned. 4. Abolish the mandate known as the Special Rapporteur on Unilateral Coercive Measures, the purpose of which is to define sanctions against Russia and other dictatorships as illegal. 5. Demand the High Commissioner and independent experts speak out against the crimes in Ukraine. Mr. President, the people of Ukraine are under assault. The time to act is now. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Amnistía Internacional.
Recording this from a safe place, but part of my team, my family, my friends are now in bomb shelters. As I speak, Russian forces are encircling cities. They are bombing schools with cluster munitions. They are wreaking havoc on civilians and civilian infrastructure. I have witnessed firsthand the unimaginable horror that I would wish on no one, and I fear the worst is yet to come. Russia's invasion to my country is deplorable. It is a violation of the United Nations Charter. It is an act of aggression and an international crime. It cannot stand. As a civilian in Ukraine, as a member of Amnesty International, I look to the UN Security Council for protection, for myself, for my family, for my country, for all those fleeing, for the civil society community in Ukraine operating at great risk. Yet, The Security Council is blocked by the same government that now invades and attacks. This is perverse. It is twisted. It is wrong. I now look to the Human Rights Council and to the ICC with the hope that their responses will be meaningful. This council must create a mechanism to protect the most vulnerable, promote accountability, and preserve evidence of crimes. I also look to Russia, where I see people taken to the streets to oppose this invasion. The same authorities that seek to crush my country are also seeking to crush their voices. The Human Rights Council must act with courage and ambition to stand against of all these violations and crimes.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Caritas Internationalis.
Caritas is gravely concerned by the current alarming humanitarian and human rights situation in Ukraine with many civilian casualties. Caritas is witnessing alarmingly high numbers of internally displaced people and people fleeing into neighboring countries, and we appreciate their generosity and solidarity. The present situation in Ukraine is endangering international stability and peace, and echoing the Holy Father brings international law into disrepute. We call for international humanitarian law and human rights to be respected. The civilian population and aid workers must not be targeted, and safe evacuation of vulnerable groups must be facilitated. We appeal to the neighboring countries to continue welcoming refugees and provide assistance without discrimination, including third country nationals. The Caritas Confederation is also deeply concerned by the safety of migrants and refugees left in Ukraine and who are in urgent need of protection. We call on the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and relevant special procedures to closely monitor the human rights situation of vulnerable groups, both in the country and on the move, and who are exposed to increased risks and human rights violations, including human trafficking. Caritas stands in solidarity with the people of Ukraine and all the victims of this crisis and appeals for peace.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Human Rights House Foundation.
Mr. President, Human Rights House Foundation strongly condemns Russia's invasion of Ukraine and is appalled by the violence inflicted upon the Ukrainian people as a result of Russia's war. We are inspired by the courage of the Ukrainian people and stand in solidarity with them as they demand international support. HRHF calls on the Human Rights Council to mandate a commission of inquiry in order to promote accountability for human rights violations associated with Russia's war against Ukraine. We also call on member states to ensure full resources are available to the UN monitoring mission in Ukraine. At the same time, we implore the Council to establish a special rapporteur on human rights in Russia. For far too long, the international community has avoided taking concrete action to hold Russian authorities accountable for their domestic campaign to target civil society, silence dissenting and opposition voices, shutter free and independent media, and ban any form of peaceful protest. We now see that these actions to repress the freedoms of assembly, association, and expression have allowed the authorities to wage an unprovoked war against their neighbor. For these reasons, we also call on the Council to request the General Assembly to suspend Russia's membership in this body. We also remind member states to take all necessary steps to ensure the safety of Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Russian human rights defenders and their families as Russian authorities expand their brutal assault against them. In the short term, governments must be prepared to use their diplomatic presence in Ukraine to protect human rights defenders and their families at significant risk and facing imminent threat by Russian authorities. HRDs and their families will also continue to require urgent and emergency visa support and resources while abroad to continue their important work. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to a joint statement by Child Rights Connect.
Joint statement by Child Rights Connect, Eurochild and other NGOs. We stand in solidarity with all the children, families and organisations that are working in Ukraine and neighbouring countries in these extremely difficult times. We're profoundly concerned by the rapidly deteriorating humanitarian situation facing children and the short and long-term consequences on their rights. We condemn the recent attacks on schools and kindergartens in Ukraine. The war will have knock-on effects throughout Europe at a time when the pandemic has already deepened inequalities. Russian Federation and Ukraine have both ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and its optional protocol on the involvement of children in armed conflict. We call on all parties to the conflict to abide by international humanitarian law and human rights law, ensure safe access to humanitarian assistance, protect civilians and vital infrastructure such as hospitals and schools. We echo the UN experts' call to protect the rights of all human rights defenders, including child human rights defenders, who are exercising their right to freedom of peaceful assembly, association and expression. As networks, organisations and individuals committed to protecting and promoting the human rights of children, we stand united against war. We reiterate the Secretary-General's call for a ceasefire and a return to dialogue to stop the escalation. We support the establishment of a commission of inquiry by the Council and any other accountability mechanisms to deal with violations and abuses of children's rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra International Service for Human Rights.
We condemn Russia's illegal war of aggression in Ukraine and associated massive human rights violations. We stand in solidarity with the people of Ukraine and with brave human rights defenders in Russia calling for an end to war and looking to the Council to contribute to peace, security and justice. We strongly support a commission of inquiry to promote accountability for human rights and humanitarian law violations and abuses associated with Russia's aggression. It is absurd and offensive to speak of constructive dialogue while Russian bombs and missiles indiscriminately kill Ukrainian children, women and men and destroy their hospitals and schools. We urge the Council to mandate a special rapporteur on human rights in Russia. Putin's ability to wage a war of aggression is aided and abetted by Russia's brutal repression of civil society, lack of free press, severe restrictions on freedom of expression, association and assembly, and massive disinformation. The Council should also recommend that the General Assembly suspend Russia's Council membership, which is a stain on the Council's institutional integrity. Finally, we welcome the unprecedented coordination, support, sanctions and humanitarian assistance provided by EU and other states in response to this crisis. We hope that this becomes the principal benchmark rather than the selective exception as to how the global community responds to all such grave human rights situations and brutal authoritarians.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra International Lawyers Organization.
InternationalLawyers.org recognizes that the human right to peace is the collateral of the prohibition of the use of force and the duty of all states to resolve their disputes peacefully in the United Nations Charter. We urge both Ukraine and Russia to resolve their dispute peacefully. We urge Russia to immediately bring itself into conformity with international law by ending its use of force against Ukraine. We recognize the right of a people's fighting for self-determination to use all necessary means to achieve this right. These means should, however, be strictly directed towards achieving self-determination. We are concerned that the unlawful use of force by member states of this Council has created the impression that the use of force in international law is acceptable. We urge the Council to reiterate that all uses of force that are not a response to an armed attack are inconsistent with the right to peace. This includes the unlawful use of force against the people of Afghanistan, Iraq, Palestine, Syria, Libya, Somalia, Yemen, Sudan, Algeria, Haiti, Panama, Grenada, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, among others. If law is weaponized to punish only some unlawful uses of force, the rule of international law is weakened. All unlawful uses of force should have the consequence that they are ended and that reparations are made to those who have suffered as required by international law. The right to peace is a right of all persons.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra International Human Rights Association of American Minorities.
National Human Rights Association of American Minorities deplores the loss of life in Ukraine, calls for an immediate ceasefire and prompt humanitarian assistance. We condemn the violation of the prohibition of the use of force and deplore that over the past 30 years, Article 2.4 of the UN Charter has been violated by states who have conducted military activities without approval of the Security Council against Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria, where war crimes were committed with impunity. We deplore the continued bombardment of civilians in Yemen and condemn the silence of the international community when Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh were victims of aggression resulting in thousands of civilian deaths. Such illegal use of force created precedents of permissibility and diminished the authority of the United Nations. While Iran calls upon Russia to stop its aggression in Ukraine, third parties must refrain from adding fuel to the fire. Ukraine and NATO should respect the legitimate security interests of Russia, who feels threatened by its hostile eastward expansion and by the flooding of Ukraine with lethal weapons. We recall that Article 2.4 of the Charter prohibits not only the use of force, but also the threat thereof. In 1962, the world was saved from nuclear apocalypse by a quid pro quo. Soviets removed missiles from Cuba, Americans removed missiles from Turkey. Today, the world demands a compromise that guarantees sustainable peace based on a new security architecture for Europe and the world.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Minority Rights Group.
This statement by a Ukrainian and international coalition of Romani human rights defenders and allies to call for peace and solidarity and call on the Russian Federation to cease the violence caused by the war against Ukraine. This war is not only a threat to European security and peace, it comes with violence of international humanitarian and human rights laws under the treaties ratified by Russia. As members of global community who has and continues to face far too many tragedies, we wish to express our deep concern regarding the fast escalation of violence and the increasing number of victims this war has already caused. From the Second World War to the Balkan Wars of the late 90s, history has shown us that in times of war or conflict, the plight of Roma, as well as other minorities, is continuously ignored, rendered invisible, and used to further our persecution. As we are witnessing people of all nations stand in solidarity in countries around the world, let us collectively fight for peace, justice, and integrity concretely by continuing to unite and take stand against the forces of war and violence, calling on authorities and aid actors to ensure that Roma minorities and marginalized people are granted equal access to protection and safety when seeking refuge, including those without identity documents. As Human Rights Council, we ask you to establish a commission of inquiry able to monitor the human rights violations and violence experienced by Roma and other minorities who often face double consequences during the war. I thank you so much.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra International Humanist and Ethical Union.
Thank you, Mr. President. The unprovoked and illegal invasion by Russia in Ukraine is a violation of the UN Charter and international law, including human rights law. As each day goes by, we witness an increasing number of gross and systematic violations of human rights. It is a tragedy unfolding before our eyes. This Council has a duty to respond. It must adopt a robust resolution, unequivocally condemning Russia's actions and establishing a commission of inquiry to report on the situation in Ukraine and promote accountability for all forms of human rights violations occurring there. Such violations are clearly facilitated and sustained by the oppressive human rights climate in the Russian Federation itself. The severe restrictions on free expression, the widespread propagation of disinformation, the repression of civil society, and the intimidation, censoring, and criminalization of journalists all contribute to the Russian government being able to wage a war of aggression without accountability at home. Accordingly, any Council resolution needs to create a mandate for a special rapporteur on the human rights situation in Russia. Mr. President, we meet today at the UN Human Rights Council, a body specifically tasked with protecting and promoting the human rights of all. To have a country that is, as we speak, dropping bombs on innocent civilians and willfully blocking any action at the UN Security Council continue to sit as a member of this Council is nothing less than a stain on the Council's integrity and a shame on us all. Any resolution adopted must urge the General Assembly to suspend Russia's Human Rights Council membership immediately. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Civicus, World Alliance for Citizen Participation.
Civicus stands in solidarity with the people of Ukraine and calls for a swift, unified, and targeted international response. The protection of human rights defenders, journalists, and activists must be a priority. Human rights defenders and journalists have a responsibility to document human rights violations, a role which is critical for the international community to hold perpetrators responsible. In a letter to the United Nations Commissioner for Human Rights a few days before the invasion, the United States expressed serious concerns about information in its possession that Russia has created lists of journalists, activists, and minority groups whom they plan to kill or send to camps. All parties to the conflict have a responsibility to protect human rights defenders, journalists, and civilian populations, and to guarantee the free flow of humanitarian aid. An act of aggression on this scale needs commensurate response. We call upon the Council to create an investigative and accountability mechanism to monitor, investigate, and document human rights violations so that perpetrators can be identified and held to account. Russia is rated as repressed on the Civicus Monitor, and journalists and activists have long been the target of government crackdowns. It is clear that a nation that does not respect the rights of its own people will not respect the rights of others. In this context, Russia has no place as a member of the premier human rights body of the UN, and we join calls for Russia to be suspended from council membership.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Institute for NGO Research.
Thank you. The world is horrified and appalled by the Russian aggression against and invasion of Ukraine. Russia is engaged in mass war crimes and crimes against humanity, including indiscriminate bombings on apartment buildings, opera houses, and parks. Russia has attacked Jewish cultural heritage sites like the Babi Yar Memorial. And Russia has employed prohibited thermobaric bombs wreaking mass destruction. Unlike in other conflicts, Ukrainians are not firing hundreds of rockets a day on Moscow or St. Petersburg. They are not suicide bombing Russian buses, weddings, or kindergartens. They are not setting up their military headquarters in hospitals, nor storing mass arsenals of missiles in churches, schools, or UN facilities. They are not shooting at, balloon bombing, nor digging dozens of terror tunnels to kill and kidnap Russians living along the border. They are simply defending against a blatant attack on their existence. Since 2014, this council has done next to nothing on Russia's aggression in the region. It has adopted no company blacklist for Russian settlement business. There have been no moves to cooperate with ongoing ICC investigations. There have been no commissions of inquiry, permanent or otherwise. And just last week, a day before the invasion, UNHCR accepted a $2 million donation from Russia. Will this donation be returned? Will the members here adopt the resolution and establish a commission of inquiry? Will they provide evidence to the ICC now that the prosecutor has opened a full investigation? Mr. President, we shall wait and see. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Mat for Peace, Development and Human Rights Association.
شكرا سيدي الرئيس. تعرب مؤسسة ماعت للسلام والتنمية وحقوق الإنسان عن قلقها العميق ازاء التطورات الأخيرة في أوكرانيا، حيث ترى أن هذا التصعيد بين الجانبين الروسي والأوكراني يقوض السلم والأمن الدوليين ويجعل المدنيين هدفا للأعمال العدائية غير المشروعة التي تتعارض مع مبادئ وأحكام القانون الدولي الإنساني. لقد خلفت هذه الحرب التي لم يمر عليها سوى بضعة أيام أكثر من 100 قتيل في صفوف المدنيين، بينهم أكثر من 50 من النساء والأطفال وإصابة 400 آخرين، فيما اضطر نحو 600 ألف مدنيا للفرار جراء هذا التصعيد. لاحظت مؤسسة ماعت وجود هجمات عشوائية مدمرة للبنية التحتية والأعيان المدنية استخدمت فيها الذخائر العنقودية وهي أسلحة عشوائية محظورة دوليا. سيدي الرئيس، ترحب مؤسسة ماعت بقرار الاتحاد الأوروبي بمنح اللاجئين الأوكرانيين حق الحماية والعمل في دول الاتحاد لمدة 3 سنوات، وتطالب مؤسسة ماعت بالوقف الفوري لإطلاق النار والانخراط في مفاوضات غير مشروطة للوصول إلى هدنة إنسانية تضمن وصول المساعدات إلى الفئات المتضررة. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Access Now.
Mr. President, Your Excellencies, as we speak, the people of Ukraine continue to suffer under an illegal, brutal invasion, both offline and online. I'm drawing attention to cyber attacks that compound suffering in Ukraine and threaten human rights. We stand with the people of Ukraine as they endure Russia's large-scale invasion targeting population centers, alongside ongoing cyber attacks that impact critical services and infrastructure. Cyber attacks destroy essential systems like electrical grids and hospitals, exacerbating tensions and endangering lives. Violations of human rights online enable and escalate offline violence, and the calculated attacks targeting digital systems essential to people's safety and well-being are unacceptable. We urge the Council to take action now, first, by unequivocally condemning attacks on Ukraine's internet, telecoms, and broadcast infrastructure, which deliver essential information and systems, and to investigate serious violations of international human rights law, online and offline. Second, establish and uphold clear people-first cybersecurity standards and condemn cyber warfare as a threat to human rights in Ukraine and seek accountability for cyber attacks. Finally, timely support for local actors, particularly human rights defenders, activists, and journalists, is needed to help these vulnerable groups strengthen their resilience against cyber attacks. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra European Union of Jewish Students.
Madam President, my name is Christina Ster, and I'm the President of the Ukrainian Union of Jewish Students. I'm speaking on behalf of the European Union of Jewish Students, and I'm recording this message from bomb shelter in Kharkiv, Ukraine. So, since the start of the Putin's invasion in Ukraine, the shelling is Kharkiv never stopped, but has intensity day on a day. On Monday, I was only 500 meters away from the Russian rocket hit the building, killing 11 innocent lives, including children. Putin war has now claimed and countless lives, and the death toll is on the rise. Putin claimed that the intended denazify Ukraine, and yet our president Jewish, yet Putin's army bombed the site of Babi Yar, where 33,771 Jews were murdered during the Shoah. Yet more than the 10,000 Shoah survivors are fearing about their lives. Madam President, make no mistakes, Putin was a criminal, a war criminal. In the past days, the Ukrainian Jewish and non-Jewish life have taken an army, not just the army, the Ukrainian citizens, with the most incredible bravery. We are fighting for our rights, for our freedom, and now we are praying for the peace. Please help us.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Partners for Transparency.
Thank you, Madam President. There is no way to deny the facts indicating escalation of indiscriminate attacks on civilian objects in the framework of the armed conflict between the Russian and the Ukrainian armed forces, which violated all international laws, especially the rules of international humanitarian law. As all parties showed as a blatant disregard for the lives of civilians and used weapons with a wide impact on densely populated areas. All parties involved in the crimes against civilians and the evidence obtained by the Partner for Transparency confirms the involvement of all parties in the crime against civilians. In this way, the Ukrainian army continue to target public service and population points in Donetsk. And in this regard also, the Russian army launched the numbers of indiscriminate attacks on the number of Ukrainian cities. So, Partner for Transparency recommends that the necessary for all parties to stop targeting civilians with respect for the international humanitarian law. Second, the need to investigate all human rights crimes that occurred during this conflict and hold this responsibility on account to prevent immunity through the human rights mechanism for the Human Rights Council. Thank you, Madam President.
Tiene la palabra World Federation of Ukrainian Women's Organization.
Madam President, since 2014, the World Federation of Ukrainian Women Organizations regularly has made interventions in the Human Rights Council about the effects of Russian aggression against Ukraine and the violations of human rights in the illegally occupied Crimea and Donbass. 7 days ago, Russia started a full-scale war against Ukraine in flagrant breach of Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty and prohibition of use of force in the UN Charter. People of Ukraine have been subjected to bombing and shelling. Russian forces have targeted residential buildings, hospitals, schools, kindergartens, orphanages. The number of refugees is nearing 1 million. The situation of women and children is particularly fragile. A large number of women and children have been killed or blessed. Many women and children staying in shelters have been deprived of their basic needs. Gross violations of the right to life, liberty and security have already taken place. We are particularly concerned about the likely consequences of this brutal aggression on human rights in Ukraine through forced displacement of civilians, disappearances, restrictions of freedom of assembly and expression, persecutions and other human rights violations. Russian Federation is committing crimes against humanity and war crimes. Russia must be held accountable for that. We invite the Human Rights Council to call upon the Russian Federation to respect international humanitarian law, prevent attacks on civilians, residential areas, schools, medical institutions, and to call for all those detained to be treated consistently with international human rights law. Above all, please continue to call for an end to Russian aggression. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Campaign for Innocent Victims in Conflict.
1 week into the war, the consequences on civilian populations have been devastating. Initial reports focused on significant incidental harm resulting from war fighting in densely populated areas. As conflict escalates, we're also observing the increased use of tactics designed to create massive casualties. The international community needs to support the adoption of urgent measures to protect the civilian population of Ukraine. The absolute priority is to bring about a ceasefire and stop the fighting. Second, evacuation routes need to be urgently negotiated in order to allow civilians to safely flee. Civilians must not be prevented from fleeing nor being attacked during the process. Third, humanitarian corridors or green corridors must be established from and into areas exposed to intense fighting, where the dire need of food, medical supplies, and winterization items increases the vulnerability of the population day after day. Fourth, in order to bring about full accountability and transparency, the important work of existing monitoring and investigation mechanisms in Ukraine need to be reinforced and scaled up. And in addition, an independent fact-finding mission, for instance, under the form of an independent international commission of inquiry, needs to urgently be established to hold perpetrators into account. All parties should abide by international humanitarian law and international human rights law, and precautionary measures need to be taken in attack or against the effects of attack to protect the civilian populations of Ukraine. Thank you.
Y el último orador en la lista es Center for Global Non-Killing.
Dear human beings, Mr. President, non-killing, in reverence for life. We were all born from a mother. We were all nurtured, or will be, until we become adults, persons capable of reasoning, capable of love, and thus of respect for life, every life, universal life. Humanity is facing again a conscientious crisis. It is not a matter of winning or losing, or of strife, or of a culture of peace being stronger than a culture of war, or of how we failed, once again, to prevent it. Though, as every life, it counts. It is about leading a normal life, each and every one of us. Whatever our functions or merits, as human beings, normal people on a sustained planet in a sustained peace. There are high humble people who need to review their behaviors and attitudes regarding the right to life. If they come to respect life in all circumstances, may they be pardoned. Senseless and heartless killing must stop, now as forever. We are all part of the solution. We can all become non-killing centers. Thank you.
Muy bien, muchas gracias. Este fue el último orador de la lista. Antes de comenzar a tomar acción sobre el proyecto de resolución L1, sugiero que hagamos una prueba de votación para que cada Estado miembro se familiarice con el sistema de votación. Cuando pida a la Secretaría que abra la máquina de votación, las luces de los botones de votación empezarán a parpadear. Si desean votar sí, pulsen el botón verde más. Para el no, pulsen el botón rojo menos y el botón blanco 0 para la abstención. Ahora invito a todos los representantes que pulsen uno de estos botones en el sistema de votación, el cual tiene una pegatina con la leyenda voto y que se encuentra en la mesa de uno de sus asientos. Exercise. Estamos esperando un Mauritania que... ¿Está Mauritania en sala? ¿No está Mauritania en la sala? Ok. Si es así, pido a la Secretaría, primero a las delegaciones que comprueben si su voto se refleja correctamente en la pantalla. Y si es así, pido a la Secretaría que cierre la máquina de votación. Ahora vamos a empezar a tomar acción sobre el proyecto de resolución. Les recuerdo que el proceso de votación es un proceso en el que participan solo los Estados miembros. Los Estados observadores solo pueden intervenir en dos casos: en la fase de presentación de un proyecto de propuesta o cuando el Estado observador sea un país concernido por un proyecto de resolución o decisión. Salvo en estos dos casos, los Estados observadores no podrán tomar la palabra hasta que finalice el proceso de votación, ni para plantear una cuestión de orden. Permítanme recordarles, y esto es muy importante, que de acuerdo con nuestro proceso de votación, todas las mociones de procedimiento, como las enmiendas orales y las solicitudes de votación sobre párrafos separados, deben anunciarse durante el segmento de comentarios generales. Si una moción de procedimiento se plantea por primera vez cuando la votación ha comenzado con la explicación de voto, la moción se considerará inadmisible. Les ruego que tengan esto presente. También les recuerdo que de acuerdo con el artículo 128 del Reglamento de la Asamblea General, el patrocinador de un proyecto de propuesta o de una enmienda no está autorizado a explicar su voto sobre su propuesta o enmienda. Por último, el tiempo de intervención durante el proceso de votación es de 3 minutos para todos y todas. Excelencias, el Consejo examinará ahora el proyecto de resolución L1 titulado Situación de los derechos humanos en Ucrania derivada de la agresión rusa. Doy la palabra a la representante de Ucrania para que presente el proyecto de resolución L1 titulado Situación de los derechos humanos en Ucrania derivada de la agresión rusa. Señora embajadora, tiene la palabra.
Mr. President, the delegation of Ukraine has an honor to present for the consideration of the Human Rights Council Resolution L49/L1, Situation of Human Rights in Ukraine resulting from the Russian aggression, so far co-sponsored by 68 countries. The aim of this resolution is for the Council to exercise its primary mandate and to put an end to human rights crisis in Ukraine caused by unjustified and unprovoked military aggression by the Russian Federation. Russia attacked not only Ukraine, but every country in this room by breaching the UN Charter and fundamental principles of international law with acute human rights ramifications. Thousands of innocent civilians have now lost their lives. Russian forces continue deliberate and indiscriminate shelling of the Ukrainian cities. The number of people who were displaced has already exceeded 1 million. Destruction of the civilian infrastructure has left hundreds of thousands without access to electricity or water and other essential needs. The shelling of Europe's largest nuclear plant may lead to a global catastrophe. The situation in Ukraine is a matter of deep concern for international human rights institutions, including UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and Human Rights Council special procedures. Building upon the adopted 2 days ago General Assembly resolution Aggression against Ukraine, the present draft resolution reaffirms support for sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, condemns Russian aggression and calls for the withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukraine. The draft also includes a number of provisions that focus on human rights and humanitarian violations perpetrated by the Russian Federation. Most importantly, the initiative envisages the establishment of a commission of inquiry, which will investigate all alleged violations and abuses of human rights and violations of international humanitarian law and related crimes in the context of the Russian Federation's aggression against Ukraine, including their root causes. In the process of elaborating this initiative, we engaged with numerous delegations from every region of the world. I wish to thank all colleagues for their constructiveness and valuable proposals, including those submitted during the 2 rounds of informal consultations. We have made our best efforts to accommodate most of the received comments and suggestions and genuinely believe that the revised version, which have been distributed among delegations, has become stronger. Mr. President, the irrefutable evidence of gross and systematic human rights violation, as well as war crimes and crimes against humanity by Russia against the people of Ukraine, are building up with every minute of this war. We know who the war criminals are and who is the chief among them. It is our common duty to ensure accountability by mandating the documentation and verification of Russia's crimes and identification of those responsible. This is the only way to ensure that such blatant dereliction of human rights values, which we deeply cherish, will never repeat itself in any place of the world. Therefore, Ukraine looks forward to the adoption of this important action and counts on your active and strong support. And now, I would like to observe the moment of silence for all victims in Ukraine stemming from the Russian aggression and invite my colleagues to join me. I thank you, Mr. President.
Muchas gracias, señora embajadora. La Secretaría me ha informado de que hay 31 copatrocinadores adicionales del proyecto de resolución. Doy la palabra a los Estados miembros ahora del Consejo que deseen hacer comentarios generales sobre el proyecto de resolución L1 en su versión oralmente revisada. La delegación de la Federación Rusa tiene la palabra.
Благодарю вас, господин председатель. Мы уже высказывали свое негативное отношение к проведению срочных дебатов. Их цель для нас очевидна – отвести внимание от преступной политики киевских властей в отношении своего же народа, возложив при этом всю ответственность на Россию. Рассматриваемый проект резолюции это наглядно подтверждает. В нем нет ни слова о преследовании и убийствах журналистов, оппозиционеров, правозащитников и просто несогласных, пытках, ущемлении прав религиозных и национальных меньшинств, сужении пространства для гражданского общества, всплеске расизма и расовой дискриминации. Между тем, все это стало реальностью и неотъемлемой частью современной Украины. Прибавьте к этому развязанную Киевом войну со своим же народом в Донбассе. Все эти 8 лет Украина под одобряющие кивки своих западных кураторов осуществляла обстрелы населения Донецка и Луганска, держа в страхе их жителей. Хотя бы кто-нибудь из вас, уважаемые европейские и американские коллеги, осудил эти действия, убийство тысяч людей, детей, посочувствовал их страданиям, вызванным постоянными бомбежками и блокадой? Не нашли мы в тексте резолюции и осуждения в адрес западных кукловодов Киева, которые накачивают страну летальным оружием. По всей видимости, им безразлично, что поставляемые на Украину переносные зенитно-ракетные комплексы и другое вооружение будет убивать и калечить. Тем временем киевский режим сознательно выпускает из тюрем уголовников и бесконтрольно раздает им оружие, которое уже используется против гражданских лиц. По всей Украине орудуют мародеры, грабящие и убивающие простых людей. Не боитесь ли вы, господа западные миротворцы, что ваше вооружение попадет в руки таких уголовников и будет также использовано сначала против гражданского населения Украины, а потом вернется к вам, уже по каналам преступных группировок? Скажут ли вам за это спасибо жители Европы? Отмечаем исключительно однобокий характер рассматриваемой резолюции. Не находим в ней какой-либо практической пользы. В конце концов, для неравнодушных к ситуации на Украине уже 8 лет существует возможность высказаться в ходе регулярных диалогов в рамках СПЧ по положению с правами человека в этой стране. Добавим сюда наблюдательную миссию ООН по правам человека на Украине, которая все эти годы собирает и обобщает информацию о том, что там происходит. Это делает создание нового механизма по расследованию бесполезной траты средств, которые можно было бы направить на помощь простым гражданам Украины. Однако все это вряд ли заботит авторов резолюции, использующих любые средства для того, чтобы возложить всю ответственность за происходящее на Украине на Россию. В этой связи мы просим поставить проект резолюции на голосование и будем голосовать против этого документа. Призываем делегации также выступить против этой инициативы. Господин председатель, только что прошла минута молчания, против которой мы ничего не имеем. Считаем, что любая человеческая жизнь бесценна и требует от того, чтобы они помнили. Надеемся, что почти в память всех погибших на Украине в этот момент зал, хотя бы и присутствующие в нем дипломаты и представители Управления Верховного комиссара ООН по правам человека, наконец вспомнили о тысячах замученных и убитых киевским режимом жителей Донбасса. Благодарю вас.
Gracias. Le doy la palabra. Je donne la parole à l'ambassadeur de la France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président, Madame la Haute-Commissaire, j'ai l'honneur de m'exprimer au nom des États membres de l'Union européenne qui sont membres du Conseil des droits de l'homme. Ce commentaire général a été approuvé par l'Union européenne dans son ensemble. L'Union européenne souhaite tout d'abord féliciter et témoigner de sa solidarité et de son soutien à la délégation ukrainienne qui travaille dans des circonstances très difficiles et sous d'extrêmes pressions. Dans l'épreuve, vous avez fait tout votre possible pour tenir compte des préoccupations et des demandes de vos partenaires du monde entier afin de présenter un texte équilibré et de permettre à davantage de délégations de le coparrainer et de voter oui. Monsieur le Président, la position de l'Union européenne est désormais bien connue. Il n'y a qu'un seul agresseur dans cette guerre, c'est la Russie. Pas l'OTAN, pas l'Europe, pas l'Ukraine. La Russie doit être tenue responsable de ses actions. Malgré les appels de la communauté internationale, l'offensive russe s'intensifie au point de bombarder la centrale nucléaire civile de Zaporijia au risque de conséquences effroyables pour l'Ukraine, l'Europe et le monde. La résolution qui nous est présentée crée une commission d'enquête qui examinera toutes les violations et tous les abus des droits de l'homme et les violations du droit humanitaire international dans le contexte de l'agression de la Fédération de Russie contre l'Ukraine. L'Union européenne soutient pleinement la création de cette commission et espère qu'elle sera opérationnelle dès que possible. Pour ces raisons, les États membres de l'Union européenne qui sont membres du Conseil voteront oui à la résolution. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Merci. Tiene la palabra Alemania.
Thank you, Mr. President. Germany aligns itself with the EU statement. Yesterday's debate sent a very clear signal. The vast majority of member states condemn the Russian aggression against another state and a member of this council. The concern about the dire human rights situation caused by this aggression is close to unanimous. The Council has been clear and strong in its condemnation in a practically unprecedented manner. In her statement, the High Commissioner for Human Rights pointed out the grave human rights violations committed by the Russian forces. Those are the facts. The distortion of the truth and misinformation campaigns of one delegation must not remain unanswered. In this regard, I commend the mission of Ukraine, Ambassador Yevgenia Filipenko, and all her staff. Their courage and professionalism in these days impresses all of us. Mr. President, the territorial integrity and sovereignty of a UN member state is at stake. Fundamental principles of the UN Charter, international humanitarian law and human rights law have been violated. The country in whose territories those violations are committed is requesting the establishment of a commission of inquiry in order to ensure accountability. Let us follow this request. Germany fully supports the establishment of a commission of inquiry and the resolution we are voting on today. We call on all members of this Council and the United Nations to support this call. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Países Bajos.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Netherlands aligns itself with the general comment delivered by France on behalf of the European Union. Mr. President, the world is faced with a unique and difficult challenge. Global peace is at stake. This requires a careful and unified response. Before us today is a strong resolution that condemns the Russian aggression and reflects the gravity of the situation. The Netherlands will vote in favor of the resolution. And we will do so because the resolution contributes to international monitoring and ensures accountability through the creation of a commission of inquiry, with a strong mandate to collect and consolidate evidence of violations and abuses. The establishment of this Commission of Inquiry is a crucial step towards accountability and the prevention of impunity. We commend Ukraine for the transparent and inclusive manner in which it led the negotiations carried out under very difficult circumstances. We expect the international community to continue to be united in its condemnation of the Russian aggression and its commitment to resolving the crisis through peaceful means. And therefore, we call on all members of this Council to vote in favor of the resolution. I thank you, President.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Polonia.
Madam High Commissioner, Madam Deputy High Commissioner, Madam Assistant Secretary General, colleagues, Poland aligns itself with the general statement delivered by France on behalf of the European Union and wishes to add some remarks in its national perspective. From the very beginning of the ongoing Russian military aggression against Ukraine, Poland condemns Russian actions in the strongest terms. We are shocked by the increasing human impact, already amounting to hundreds of civilians killed and injured, and over 2 million of displaced persons, including 1 million of refugees. As the Polish Foreign Minister Zbigniew Rau said in this very council 2 days ago, this unprecedented armed attack by Russia destroys the foundation of the existing security architecture and constitutes a flagrant violation of international law, including the United Nations Charter. It is openly confirming our worst fears that Russia holds human rights in complete disregard. What we have seen in the recent days is inconceivable for a peaceful and safe world. A state, permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, as well as a member of this Council, has invaded an independent state and, with cold blood, attacked its citizens, including women and children. It seems that tragedies of the past 20th century world are emerging. We cannot remain passive while facing these atrocities. Today it is crucial to stop the aggression and to prevent the aggressor from committing further violations of international law, including humanitarian law and human rights law. This is why Poland strongly supports the resolution situation of human rights in Ukraine stemming from the Russian aggression tabled by Ukraine. This resolution focuses on the critical human aspect of the Russian aggression, but also proposes to establish a commission of inquiry to investigate all human rights violations and abuses related to this aggression, and to collect the evidence with a view to bring the perpetrators to justice. This is of crucial importance for us, for this Council, to make this happen. And for these reasons, Poland will support the resolution, will vote in favour of this resolution, and respectfully ask all the other members of this Council to do so. I thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra el Reino Unido.
Presidente. 4 years ago today, Russian military intelligence officials carried out a chemical attack in the British city of Salisbury. Today, we see Russian forces attacking a nuclear energy plant in Ukraine. There is no limit, it seems, to the actions of President Putin's regime. This week we have seen an unprecedented show of unity by the international community. In the UN Security Council, in the UN General Assembly, and today, I hope, here in this Council, of which we tribute to our Ukrainian colleagues, who, working in the most difficult personal and professional circumstances, as they think of their loved ones under attack from missiles and bombs and tanks and the streets of their homeland, have risen with the greatest professionalism to work with all of us to ensure that today this Council speaks out in the clearest possible terms in support of the very principles on which this organisation was founded, in support of the Charter, in support of international law, in support of territorial integrity, in support of sovereignty, in support of democracy, in support of human rights, and in support of fundamental freedoms. The freedom for a country to choose its own destiny. I urge all our fellow members of this Council to join with us to support Ukraine in this hour of need and to support the draft resolution in front of us. Thank you very much.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Lituania.
Thank you, Mr. President, Madam High Commissioner, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen.
Lithuania fully supports the statement delivered earlier on behalf of the European Union. And Lithuania, in the strongest possible terms, condemns Russia's open, large-scale aggression against independent, peaceful, and democratic state of Ukraine. And we must be very clear about the terminology we use. It is not conflict in Ukraine. It is Russia's aggression on Ukraine. Even more, it is attack against us all, against the international law and rules, against the multilateral system we believe in. Participation of Belarus in this attack means sharing responsibility for its consequences. This brutal invasion is an appalling and flagrant violation of the Charter of the United Nations, the Helsinki Final Act, the Budapest Memorandum, and the Charter of Paris. Also, we must not be carried away by lies and misinformation the Russian Federation uses. We call on the international community to see the facts. The human rights and humanitarian situation in Ukraine is worsening as we speak. The number of civilian casualties is growing. Concern about the fate of those within the territory under attack or siege by Russian troops is alarmingly rising. This morning, we saw attack on the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. If it will be damaged, human suffering will be of unspeakable proportions. The United Nations General Assembly 2 days ago sent a strong message to the world, and the Human Rights Council cannot be silent. It is this Council's role to address situations of gross human rights violations and also take immediate steps to prevent them. Therefore, we fully supported Ukraine's request for an urgent debate and stand fully behind the resolution before us today. The gravity of the situation fully justifies the establishment of a commission of inquiry, and the aggressor must be stopped and held accountable. Lithuania will vote in favor of the resolution, and we call on other members of this Council to do the same. I thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra la delegación de Estados Unidos de América.
Mr. President, Excellencies, Russia must be held to account for the grave human rights situation caused by its senseless, premeditated, and unprovoked military attack on Ukraine. The High Commissioner for Human Rights has stated that Russia's vicious action clearly violates international law and puts at risk countless lives. The Secretary General has lamented the rising death toll and concluded that Russia has violated the UN Charter, Article 2(4) of which states that all member states shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. With millions of civilian lives at stake, Ukrainian and non-Ukrainian alike, as Russian troops open fire on the streets of Kyiv, as they drop bombs on residential buildings in populated areas, as they shell kindergarten students in their schools, Russia must be held to account by this Council. Over 1 million people have been forced to flee their homes in fear of their lives. The United States stands for upholding international law. The United States stands in support of the UN Charter. Mr. President, Excellencies, the United States and all American people stand with Ukraine and its people. Thank you.
Gracias. Ahora no hay más. Ahora escucharemos al otro país concernido mencionado en el proyecto. Doy ahora la palabra al distinguido representante de Belarus.
Благодарю, господин председатель. Мы не поддерживаем представленный проект резолюции Л1. Этот документ не содействует политико-дипломатическому урегулированию конфликта. Беларусь приняла участие в консультациях по Л1 и внесла ряд конструктивных предложений, нацеленных на поддержку переговорного процесса между сторонами конфликта в текущей ситуации, когда льется кровь братских славянских народов. К сожалению, наши предложения проигнорировали. Шокирует тот факт, что в резолюции нет ни слова про переговоры и мир, Похоже, что поддержка переговорного процесса ради мира волнует белорусских дипломатов больше других. Сожалеем и о том, что авторы резолюции проигнорировали предложения Беларуси, нацеленные на предотвращение попадания в зону конфликта наемников и летального оружия. Ряд западных стран осуждает Беларусь за, как они выражаются, поддержку агрессии против Украины. И об этом идет речь в Л1. Но давайте скажем себе честно, кто подпитывает пламя конфликта в Украине? В отличие от соавторов резолюции, Беларусь не направляет в зону конфликта оружие и наемников. И нет ни одного белорусского солдата на украинской земле. И напротив, по сообщениям, Польша уже пропустила только из Хорватии 200 наемников. Отдельные западные политики поддерживают призывы к иностранцам ехать воевать в Украину. Германия и Литва, которая говорит о нашей ответственности, заявили, что не будут препятствовать выезду в зону конфликта так называемых добровольцев. Вы, соавторы проекта резолюции Л1, упрекающие нас в нарушениях прав человека, предали свои идеалы, которым поклонялись, когда сейчас, без колебаний, лишаете инвалидов права на участие в Паралимпийских играх, запрещаете спортсменам участвовать в международных соревнованиях, лишаете миллионы людей по всему миру права на свободу передвижения, закрывая воздушное пространство, когда разрываете контракты с артистами, отчисляете по национальной принадлежности студентов из университетов, останавливаете гуманитарные проекты для детей, отключаете людей от международных платежных систем и сервисов, лишаете людей права на информацию, отключая им доступ ко всем информационным ресурсам из России и Беларуси. Даже сайты белорусских дипмиссий с консульской информацией, адресованной простым гражданам, полностью заблокированы в Европе. Этим самым соавторы резолюции вытерли ноги о всеобщую декларацию прав человека. Вы извратили смысл работы правозащитных механизмов ООН и УВКПЧ, фактически лишили их нейтральности и превратили в проводников своих интересов, сузив их функции до подобия судилищ. Беларусь, как братский народ России и Украине, сейчас обеспечивает условия для того, чтобы стороны конфликта могли в безопасных условиях договориться друг с другом. И мы планируем продолжить эту благородную миссию, потому что понимаем, что скорейшего завершения конфликта ждут все народы. По вышеуказанным причинам Беларусь призывает не поддерживать проект резолюции Л1. Я благодарю вас.
Muchas gracias. La Secretaría me ha informado de que hay consecuencias presupuestarias por programas por un importe de $4.163.500 americanos para este proyecto de resolución. Una copia de la declaración ha sido publicada en la extranet del Consejo. El Consejo procederá ahora a tomar una decisión sobre el proyecto de resolución L1 en su versión oralmente revisada. Daré la palabra a los miembros del Consejo que deseen hacer explicaciones de voto antes de la votación sobre el proyecto de resolución L1 en su versión oralmente revisada. La delegación de China tiene la palabra.
主席先生，中方一直密切关注乌克兰局势，支持和鼓励一切有利于和平解决乌克兰危机的外交努力。当前联合国采取的任何行动，都要以地区和平稳定和各方普遍安全为重，应当有助于局势降温，推动外交解决。 中方一向反对将人权问题政治化和借人权问题对别国施压，不赞成任何可能激化矛盾的做法。因此，我们反对设立乌克兰问题独立国际调查委员会。中国代表团不能支持 L1号决议草案。谢谢主席先生。
Muchas gracias. Tiene la palabra Gambia. Microphone, please. Ambassador. Ambassador, please.
Provoked.
Microphone, and you can start again, please. Thank you.
Good afternoon. As Gambia sits here, we wish to take the floor and add our voice on a very difficult moment. Our collective conscience is not only tested, but provoked. The fact that the global community is dealing with this very unfortunate situation, and more importantly, loss of human lives and rights, is indeed disheartening. The Gambia is disturbed with the far-reaching implications of such acts to the global community. Multilateralism, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and our collective humanity is provoked in bounds that we have never experienced for a very long time. The Gambia stands for upholding international law and the UN Charter and protection of humanity and sovereignty of nations. We encourage all of us to sit back for a moment and draw to our humanity and encourage courage and conviction and diplomatic solutions for the bloodshed to stop. We're losing children, we're losing women, we're losing elderly. Rhetoric is not going to restore our humanity. Excellencies, as we go through the political ping-pongs, we must know that human lives continues to be affected. We are disheartened as a nation, and our thoughts and our prayers are for the lives that are lost. We thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra la delegación de Cuba.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Señor presidente, Cuba es un país defensor del derecho internacional y la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, referencias medulares para los países pequeños contra el hegemonismo, los abusos de poder y las injusticias. Defendemos la paz en todas las circunstancias y nos oponemos sin ambigüedades al uso o amenaza del uso de la fuerza contra cualquier Estado. Estamos comprometidos con el derecho internacional humanitario y llamamos a todas las partes a proteger la población, sus bienes y la infraestructura civil. Lamentamos profundamente las pérdidas de vida de inocentes. El pueblo cubano ha tenido y tiene una relación entrañable con el pueblo ucraniano. Señor presidente, Cuba ha rechazado siempre la selectividad, los dobles raseros y la manipulación de los derechos humanos con fines políticos. Es un tema que conocemos bien. Nuestro país es víctima directa de esas inaceptables prácticas. Escuchando las intervenciones de algunos países, parecería que se ha hecho justicia a las atroces violaciones de los derechos humanos perpetradas en el pasado reciente. Baste mencionar los vuelos secretos con personas secuestradas, las ejecuciones extrajudiciales, la imposición de medidas coercitivas unilaterales y criminales bloqueos contra pueblos enteros. y el establecimiento de campos de concentración y tortura. Ni una sola resolución se ha podido adoptar sobre esas graves situaciones. No lo han permitido muchos de los que hoy demandan actuación inmediata ante los acontecimientos en Ucrania. Señor presidente, como cuestión de principios, Cuba comparte la posición del movimiento de países no alineados contraria a la imposición de resoluciones y mandatos contra países. Jamás se logrará una real cooperación en materia de derechos humanos sin el consentimiento y el compromiso de los Estados concernidos. El proyecto de resolución presentado vulnera los principios básicos del diálogo respetuoso, la no selectividad y la no politización que deben guiar la labor de este Consejo. Es un texto parcializado que no responde a preocupaciones genuinas por la situación de derechos humanos en Ucrania. Mucho menos ofrece soluciones para promover el ejercicio efectivo de esos derechos, sin exclusiones. Asignar responsabilidades a solo una de las partes involucradas es, cuando menos, un enfoque sesgado e incompleto del asunto, que no podemos apoyar. Cuba continuará abogando por una solución diplomática de la actual crisis en Europa, por medios pacíficos que garantice la seguridad y soberanía de todos, el ejercicio efectivo de los derechos humanos, la paz y la seguridad regional e internacional. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra el distinguido delegado de de Venezuela.
Gracias, presidente. Venezuela reitera todo lo expresado en el día de ayer durante este debate urgente sobre la crisis en Ucrania. Para nosotros resulta claro que son las graves provocaciones de Estados Unidos y la OTAN, basados en una peligrosa visión hegemónica del mundo, las que agudizaron el conflicto y originaron todo el sufrimiento actual a las poblaciones de Ucrania y Rusia. Lamentamos constatar que el proyecto de resolución presentado no es equilibrado. Adolece de serios desbalances en sus argumentaciones y planteamientos dirigidos exclusivamente en contra de una de las partes en el conflicto. Venezuela ratifica su firme posición de principios de rechazo a la imposición selectiva de mecanismos contra países específicos y más aún cuando estos no cuentan con el consentimiento del país concernido. No podemos aceptar bajo ningún concepto la instrumentalización de los derechos humanos con fines políticos. Saludamos con esperanza y optimismo la continuación de las negociaciones en curso entre las partes y hacemos un llamado a acelerar la desescalada y encontrar fórmulas de entendimiento sobre la base de un diálogo franco que no sea entorpecido por injerencias externas ni presiones financieras o políticas como las medidas coercitivas unilaterales implementadas contra la Federación de Rusia en abierta contravención al derecho internacional. Señor presidente, sin menoscabo de conocer y condenar las causas de la actual situación, Venezuela tiene un amplio historial en la mediación diplomática y en la resolución de conflictos. Recordamos, por ejemplo, el compromiso personal y diplomático del presidente Hugo Chávez para lograr la pacificación de nuestra vecina Colombia, dejando a un lado cualquier consideración bélica. Venezuela se opone, por principios y por su tradición histórica, a cualquier forma violenta de resolver los conflictos y confía en el diálogo efectivo como el mejor camino para la resolución pacífica de las divergencias. La principal razón de este Consejo es preservar los derechos humanos de las poblaciones de ambos países y ofrecer un claro mensaje de paz. Por tales razones, confiando plenamente en la necesidad de generar una vía de confianza para labrar la paz, Venezuela se abstendrá en la votación del proyecto de resolución 49/L.1, sin que ello suponga que su actual posición pueda ser considerada como un precedente en la constitución de mandatos que entorpecen la suprema labor de este Consejo en defensa de los derechos humanos. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. No veo ninguna otra solicitud de palabra. Por lo tanto, a petición de la delegación de la Federación Rusa, el Consejo procederá ahora a una votación registrada. Perdón, la delegación de Eritrea tiene la palabra.
Thank you, President. Eritrea reiterates its statement on the urgent debate it submitted on the situation yesterday. On this regard, Eritrea sees the debate as a political exercise with very little contribution to curbing genuine human suffering. We believe it doesn't contribute to the sustenance of peace, security, and indeed collective security of both Russia and Ukraine. There is no consent by the country concerned, and introducing coercive measures will be counterproductive. The resolution itself lacks adequate balance on the victims of the human rights violations. It is from this point that we object to the resolution. Apart from this, Eritrea stands with all victims of the conflict. And for these reasons, we will not support the resolution.
Gracias. Ahora sí, no habiendo más solicitudes de palabra, a petición de la delegación de la Federación Rusa, el Consejo procederá ahora a una votación registrada sobre el proyecto de resolución L1 en su versión oralmente revisada. Pido ahora a la Secretaría que abra el dispositivo de votación y solicito a todas las delegaciones que registren su voto. ¿Están todos? Han registrado todas las delegaciones su voto. Pido a las delegaciones que comprueben que su voto se refleja correctamente en la pantalla. Si es así, pido a la Secretaría que cierre el dispositivo de votación. La votación está cerrada. Los resultados de la votación registrada son los siguientes: 32 votos a favor, 2 votos en contra, 13 votos en abstención. El proyecto de resolución L1 en su versión oralmente revisada es, por lo tanto, adoptado. Copia del resultado de la votación se cargará en breve en la extranet. Ahora le doy la palabra a los miembros del Consejo que deseen hacer explicaciones de voto luego de la votación. La delegación de Qatar tiene la palabra.
السيد الرئيس، صوتت دولة قطر لصالح مشروع القرار الذي تم اعتماده اليوم في هذا المجلس، وذلك انطلاقا من التزامها بالمبادئ الأساسية التي تقوم عليها سياستها الخارجية، والالتزام بمبادئ القانون الدولي وميثاق الأمم المتحدة، لا سيما الامتناع عن التهديد باستخدام القوة أو استخدامها، وتسوية النزاعات الدولية بالوسائل السلمية، والالتزام بالسيادة والاستقلال السياسي والسلامة الإقليمية للدول الأعضاء. ومن هذا المنطلق تؤكد دولة قطر على احترام سيادة واستقلال أوكرانيا ووحدة أراضيها في حدودها المعترف بها دوليا. السيد الرئيس، لقد استند تصويت دولة قطر على مشروع القرار على أساس قانوني، حيث ركز مضمونه على المواثيق والأعراف الدولية وميثاق الأمم المتحدة ومبادئ القانون الدولي والقانون الدولي لحقوق الإنسان والقانون الدولي الإنساني، وهي مبادئ مشتركة ومتفق عليها. وإننا نفهم أن الغرض من مشروع القرار هو إقامة هذه المبادئ الراسخة والتأكيد عليها. السيد الرئيس، تؤمن دولة قطر بأن السبيل الوحيد لتسوية النزاع الدائر في أوكرانيا وتلبية المشاغل المشروعة لجميع الأطراف يتمثل في عدم اتخاذ ما من شأنه أن يؤدي إلى مزيد من التصعيد، وحث جميع الأطراف على ضبط النفس والمضي قدما في الحوار البناء والمسار الدبلوماسي من أجل التوصل إلى حلول شاملة وتوافقية ومستدامة مبنية على تنفيذ الاتفاقات القائمة ومبادئ القانون الدولي وميثاق الأمم المتحدة. كما تعرب دولة قطر عن القلق من تفاقم الحالة الإنسانية الراهنة للمدنيين في أوكرانيا، وتؤكد على ضرورة تيسير وصول المساعدات الإغاثية للمحتاجين والالتزام بالمبادئ الأساسية لتقديم المساعدات الإنسانية وضمان سلامة المدنيين والمرافق المدنية كأولوية قصوى. ختاما، تواصل دولة قطر اتصالاتها مع جميع الأطراف وتحثهم على إنهاء الأزمة بالحوار والطرق الدبلوماسية، كما تقوم بالتنسيق مع الجهات الإنسانية من أجل تقديم المساعدات إلى جميع المحتاجين لها. وشكرا السيد الرئيس.
Muchas gracias. Tiene la palabra la delegación de Libia.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. سيد الرئيس، لقد صوتنا دعما لقرار مجلس حقوق الإنسان بشأن الوضع في أوكرانيا نتيجة للعدوان الروسي، وذلك التزاما منا بمبادئ القانون الدولي وميثاق الأمم المتحدة، والتي تمنع التهديد باستعمال القوة واستخدامها ضد سلامة الأراضي أو الاستقلال السياسي لأي دولة أو على أي وجه آخر لا يتفق ومقاصد الأمم المتحدة. وانبثق ذلك من تجربتنا، فقد عانت بلادي كثيرا من التدخلات الأحادية وغير المشروعة في شؤوننا الداخلية، الأمر الذي كان له الأثر المباشر في زيادة حدة الصراع وارتكاب كثير من انتهاكات القانون الدولي الإنساني وحقوق الإنسان. وأشير هنا إلى الدور الخطير التي قامت به بعض العناصر المسلحة الأجنبية في ليبيا، ولذلك نؤكد على احترام الاستقلال السياسي وسلامة الأراضي وسيادة كل الدول ومنع التدخل في شؤونها الداخلية. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Shukran. Tiene la palabra la delegación de Malasia.
Mr. President, Malaysia is seriously concerned with the situation in Ukraine, and we reiterate our call for an immediate ceasefire and de-escalation of hostilities. We call upon all parties to uphold and respect the principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations and international law, including respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, as well as peaceful settlement of disputes in the maintenance of international peace and security. Malaysia abides and strongly upholds the principles and purposes of the United Nations Charter and international law, and these principles have guided us in our decision today. Malaysia believes in the important role of the Human Rights Council in addressing human rights situations in impartial and objective manner. Thus, it is always our endeavor to help create the right fundamentals for constructive engagement and dialogue at the Council. It is driven by our desire to ensure the continued relevance and effectiveness of the Human Rights Council. This is in accordance with the pledges we made when we sought membership of this Council. This Council is far too important, and we must not set it up for failure. Malaysia has voted in favor of the resolution based on our strong conviction of the need to uphold the fundamental principles of the United Nations Charter. It is important that all parties cooperate and abide by the decisions contained in the resolution. At the same time, we strongly encourage members of this august body to continue to facilitate dialogue in a balanced and objective manner towards finding a diplomatic solution to the conflict. This is our collective responsibility in accordance with our commitments under the Charter. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Nepal. Perfecto.
Mr. President, the situation in Ukraine is a matter of grave concern. It is urgent to ensure safety and security of lives and property and protect fundamental human rights of peoples in Ukraine. All UN members have the obligation to fully respect the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity as enshrined in the UN Charter. Diplomacy and dialogue should be fully utilized by the parties concerned to resolve disputes peacefully and amicably. With the expectation that this resolution will contribute towards these principles and values, Nepal voted in favor of the resolution. I thank you.
Gracias. Tem a palavra a delegação do Brasil.
Muito obrigado, Senhor Presidente. Madam High Commissioner, the deteriorating circumstances on the ground have convinced us of the need for the Human Rights Council to add its voice to the Security Council and the General Assembly in seeking solutions to the crisis in Ukraine. For this reason, we supported the current urgent debate. There is an imperative need for all relevant UN bodies to work together towards re-establishing peace, safeguarding security, and protecting human rights and fundamental freedoms in Ukraine. Despite constructive proposals during the negotiations of the resolution, we are disappointed by the text before us. Brazil would have favored a more balanced draft that could create space for dialogue among all parties and send a strong message for respect of international human rights law. Unfortunately, the current text is flawed. While we are pleased to note that the mandate of the Commission of Inquiry has been refocused to address the current crisis rather than past events, we still believe it is not an appropriate mechanism at this stage to assess and review the facts on the ground. Given the lack of objective and verifiable information available regarding human rights violations and abuses, we reiterate our view that a fact-finding mission with a robust but fair mandate would be a more effective and efficient tool to achieve our immediate common objectives. We're also frustrated that our comments regarding key language on peace and security were not duly taken on board. The text still contains a number of references which would be better addressed in other UN fora, like the Security Council and the General Assembly, rather than the Human Rights Council. Much of the terminology used in the text is clearly inspired by recent Security Council initiatives, while concepts related to humanitarian and refugee law are imprecise. In the context of the HRC, such language constitutes unjustifiable precedent that can only exacerbate the politicization of our deliberations.
In addition, we consider that references to future legal procedures preempt the result of the proposed investigations. We need first to gather, verify, and assess facts on the ground before making recourse to international courts. Such references are counterproductive at this point in time and will not contribute to the goals advocated by this Council, which should be primarily to promote respect to human rights and to further avoid civilian people suffering in Ukraine. Likewise, Brazil is concerned that the inclusion in the current resolution of a specific paragraph on ICC initiatives could establish a dangerous interdependence between that august body and Human Rights Council proceedings, bypassing established channels and procedures. Despite the shortcomings that we have outlined, we above all believe that this Council cannot stay silent. It must first and foremost act according to its mandate to protect human rights in Ukraine and support a peaceful solution to the crisis in the country. For these reasons, Brazil decided to vote in favor of the resolution on the situation of human rights in Ukraine. Thank you. Obrigado. Tiene la palabra Indonesia.
Mr. President, respect toward the sovereignty and territorial integrity for all nations, and not only for some nations, has been two of the most fundamental principles that Indonesia deems utmost importance, including in our nation-building journey. For this reason, Indonesia rejects any action that undermine these principles, including military aggression and support of separatism against sovereign state. The attack against Ukraine has resulted in a loss of innocent lives and massive displacement, which also affected a substantial number of Indonesian citizens living in Ukraine. We therefore welcome the resolution prioritization of civilian protection, the call for immediate, safe and unhindered humanitarian access and protection of all persons fleeing the conflict without discrimination. In this regard, we called upon the Council to also pay particular attention to the racism and discrimination based on race, nationality and ethnicity that has become prevalent in the media coverage of the attack. At the same time, Indonesia is aware that escalation of violence is not exclusively committed by only one party of the conflict. It is for this reason that my delegation has called for the cessation of hostilities, the escalation of the conflict, and for all the parties to immediately pursue peace through dialogue and diplomacy. Furthermore, we encourage the international community to contribute to the de-escalation of the situation by creating an enabling and conducive environment for negotiation between the parties and not fueling hostilities. Based on this consideration, Indonesia has voted in favor of the present resolution. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra la delegación de Ucrania.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to make a general comment here. The delegation of Ukraine welcomes the adoption of today's resolution, which has brought together UN members from all regions of the world against the aggression and human rights violations and breaches of international law. I thank all those who voted for the right cause. А теперь я хотела бы обратиться к российским и белорусским дипломатам и гражданам этих стран, которые работают в Женеве. Находясь здесь, вы все прекрасно видите и все прекрасно понимаете. И у каждого человека есть возможность выбора. Продолжать защищать зло или сохранить человеческое достоинство. И этот выбор за вами. I thank you, Mr. President.
Gracias. Excelencias, con esto llegamos al final del debate urgente sobre la situación de los derechos humanos en Ucrania como consecuencia de la agresión rusa. Nos volveremos a reunir dentro de unos minutos, pero en la sala 19, para tratar las cuestiones de organización y de procedimiento, abrir el punto 2 y proceder con el diálogo interactivo sobre el informe de la alta comisionada sobre los territorios palestinos ocupados. Nos vemos en la sala 19. Gracias.